If you ever found yourself stepping out of a time machine into the middle of Athens during its golden age, the first thing that would hit you wouldn't be the wisdom of Socrates or the architectural majesty of the Parthenon, but a smell so potent it could probably peel the paint off a modern-day Ferrari. We have this sanitized, Hollywood-approved image of ancient Greeks as pristine figures in white marble-like robes, wandering through clean corridors. But the reality was a lot more organic, a lot more humid, and frankly, a lot more disgusting than your history teacher ever dared to mention. Forget the romanticized myths for a moment, because the daily life of a Greek citizen was a bizarre blend of high-level intellectualism and bodily habits that would make a Victorian chimney sweep gag. Let us start with the original celebrity obsession, which makes our modern obsession with Taylor Swift's private jet look perfectly sane. If you were a top-tier athlete in ancient Greece, you weren't just a sports star. You were a walking, breathing pharmacy. These athletes competed completely naked, which was a spectacle in itself, but before they hit the dirt, they would slather their entire bodies in a thick layer of olive oil. By the time they finished wrestling in the sun and dust, their bodies were covered in a gray, viscous sludge consisting of oil, sweat, dirt, and layers of dead skin cells. This charming mixture was known as gloios. Instead of just hopping in a shower like a normal human being, athletes would use a curved metal tool called a strigil to scrape this filth off their skin. But here's the kicker: they didn't throw it away. This biohazardous slime was collected, bottled, and sold to the public as a high-end medicinal ointment. People would pay top drachma to rub this heroic sweat onto their own skin to cure aches, pains, or even just as a general health tonic. Imagine walking into a pharmacy today and buying a jar of LeBron James's post-game back sweat to rub on your sore neck. That was the level of fanaticism we are talking about. To the Greeks, the sweat of an Olympic champion wasn't just waste, it was a physical manifestation of excellence that you could literally smear on your face. But if you think the skincare was rough, wait until you hear about their bathroom routine. Long before the invention of the 3-ply quilted toilet paper we take for granted today, the Greeks had to get creative, and their solution was as hard as, well, a rock. They used something called pessoi. These were small, smooth pebbles or broken shards of ceramic that had been ground down to have rounded edges. Yes, you heard that correctly. The foundation of Western philosophy was built by people who wiped their backsides with stones. There's even a famous Greek proverb that suggests 3 stones are enough to wipe, which sounds like a very painful challenge. But there was a darker, more political side to this hygiene habit. Sometimes, instead of random stones, they would use ostraka. These were the ceramic fragments used in the Athenian voting process to banish unpopular politicians. If a citizen really hated a certain leader, they would write that person's name on the shard, use it to clean themselves in the most literal sense possible, and then discard it. It was the ultimate political statement, a way of telling your local congressman exactly what you thought of his new tax policy in the most visceral way imaginable. It gives a whole new meaning to dirty politics. Moving from the latrines to the vanity mirror, the Greek standards of feminine beauty were equally baffling. If you were a woman in ancient Athens and you wanted to be considered the peak of attractiveness, you didn't want 2 separate, perfectly arched eyebrows. No, you wanted one solid, continuous line of hair stretching across your forehead. The unibrow was the ultimate symbol of intelligence, purity, and status. If nature didn't bless you with a hairy bridge between your eyes, you didn't fret, you just improvised. Women would use black soot to paint a connecting line, or in more high-fashion cases, they would take tufts of black goat hair, dip them in tree resin, and glue them to their foreheads to create a magnificent fuzzy unibrow. Picture a high society dinner where everyone is trying to look their best, but half the women are worried their goat hair eyebrows might lose their grip and fall into the wine. It was a time when looking like a sophisticated muppet was the highest form of elegance. And it wasn't just the eyebrows that got the DIY treatment. Hair color was a literal death trap. While most Greeks were naturally dark-haired, there was a cultural obsession with blonde hair, which was associated with the gods and the legendary heroes of the Iliad. To achieve that sun-kissed Olympian look, people resorted to some truly terrifying chemistry. One popular recipe involved mixing yellow flour with a cocktail of vinegar, lime, and sometimes even arsenic. But if you were feeling particularly adventurous, you might go for the organic route, which involved a mixture of bird droppings and stale urine. They would apply this pungent paste to their hair and sit out in the scorching Mediterranean sun for hours, hoping the chemical reaction would bleach their locks before the arsenic poisoned their brain or the smell caused a local evacuation. The sheer dedication to being a blonde bombshell involved a literal risk of exploding or at least losing all your hair in a chemical fire. It proves that the no pain, no gain mantra was alive and well long before the first CrossFit gym. This intense focus on personal image and public perception was all part of being a citizen, a role that the Greeks took more seriously than life itself. In fact, if you lived in Athens and decided that you just weren't that into politics, or if you preferred to stay home and mind your own business instead of debating laws at the agora, the society had a very specific word for you. They called such a person an idiotess. This word originally didn't mean someone with a low IQ. It referred to a private person, someone who was so self-absorbed and disconnected from the community that they failed to fulfill their civic duty. To the Greeks, being an idiotess was the ultimate social disgrace. They believed that a man who didn't take an interest in the state was not harmless, but utterly useless. Over time, because these private people were seen as so disconnected from reality and common sense, the word evolved into the modern English idiot. So, the next time you feel like skipping an election or ignoring the news, just remember that in the eyes of Pericles or Plato, you are literally fulfilling the etymological definition of a fool. In ancient Greece, you were either a polites, a citizen of the city, or you were an idiot. There was no middle ground, and there was certainly no room for the quiet life if you wanted to maintain your dignity. If you think the Greeks were just a bunch of guys in bed sheets arguing about shadows on a cave wall, you are about to have your mind blown by a level of technology that shouldn't have existed for another 1,000 years. We often look back at the ancient world through a lens of primitive simplicity, imagining that they were just barely figuring out how to stack stones while we have the Silicon Valley. But the truth is that the Greeks were tinkering with gears, steam, and automation in a way that makes the Middle Ages look like the Stone Age. While most of Europe was busy figuring out which mud was the tastiest, the Greeks were essentially building the world's first analog computer. In 1901, a group of sponge divers off the coast of the island of Antikythera stumbled upon a Roman shipwreck that held a secret more valuable than any gold coin. Among the statues in amphorae was a lump of corroded green bronze that looked like nothing special. It sat in a museum for decades before scientists realized it contained dozens of intricate, hand-cut bronze gears. This is the Antikythera mechanism, and it is arguably the most shocking physical object ever pulled from the ancient world. This device was a 2,000-year-old astronomical calculator. By turning a small hand crank, a user could track the positions of the sun, the moon, and the 5 known planets with terrifying precision. It could predict lunar and solar eclipses down to the hour, and it even had a dial to keep track of the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games. The level of mathematical complexity and mechanical engineering required to build this didn't reappear in history until the 14th century with the arrival of cathedral clocks. To put that into perspective, finding this in an ancient shipwreck is like finding a jet engine inside a Viking longboat. It proves that the Greeks had a grasp of mechanical movement that was so far ahead of its time it's almost spooky. But the Greeks didn't just use their genius for the stars, they also used it to keep the gods happy and the temple coffers full. Enter Hero of Alexandria, a man who was basically the Tony Stark of the 1st century. One of his most capitalist inventions was the world's first vending machine. Yes, the same technology you use to get a bag of stale Cheetos was originally used to dispense holy water. In the temples of Alexandria, people were taking more holy water than they were paying for, which is a classic human problem. Hero's solution was a sealed vessel with a slot at the top. When a worshiper dropped a 5-drachma coin into the slot, the coin landed on a finely balanced lever. The weight of the coin pushed the lever down, which opened a valve and allowed a set amount of holy water to flow out. As the coin eventually slid off the tilted lever, the valve snapped shut, and the transaction was complete. It was a perfect automated system that removed the need for a priest to stand there and collect money. It's a hilarious reminder that even 2,000 years ago, people were looking for ways to automate customer service and maximize profit margins in the name of religion. If that wasn't enough to convince you of their mechanical wizardry, consider the fact that the Greeks actually invented the steam engine and then they just ignored it. Hero of Alexandria created a device called the aeolipile, or wind ball. It was a hollow sphere mounted on a pair of pipes connected to a boiling cauldron of water. As the steam rose through the pipes and into the sphere, it escaped through 2 curved nozzles, causing the sphere to spin at high speeds. It was a genuine steam turbine, the very technology that would eventually power the Industrial Revolution and change the world forever. But here is the tragic irony. The Greeks never used it to build a train or a factory. To them, it was just a temple miracle or a clever toy to amuse guests at parties. Why? Because they had a massive population of slaves to do all the heavy lifting. When human labor is cheaper than firewood and bronze, there is no economic pressure to build a machine. We were literally one social shift away from having steam-powered chariots in the year 50 AD. But the Greeks were too comfortable with their social structure to realize they were holding the key to the future in their hands. The Greeks were also obsessed with the idea of living machines, or what we would today call robots and automata. They didn't just want machines that worked, they wanted machines that performed. In the city of Byzantium, an engineer named Philon built an automatic maid that could mix wine and water for guests. When a person placed a cup in the maid's mechanical hand, a system of weights and air pressure would trigger the pouring of wine and then the pouring of water to dilute it, stopping exactly when the cup was full. Hero of Alexandria took this even further by creating entire mechanical theaters. Imagine a stage where the doors open, tiny wooden figures move through a scene, dolphins jump in a mechanical sea, and fires are lit and extinguished, all powered by a complex system of falling weights and knotted ropes that acted like a primitive computer program. They even had automatic doors in temples that would swing open miraculously when a priest lit a fire on an altar, using the expansion of heated air to pump water into a bucket that acted as a counterweight. To the average citizen, it looked like the gods were present. To the engineers, it was just a very clever application of physics. Even the great triest of philosophy wasn't immune to the need for a bit of mechanical assistance. Plato, the man who gave us the Republic and the theory of forms, was apparently a bit of a stickler for punctuality. He hated it when his students showed up late to his lectures at the academy, but since this was an era before the digital alarm clock on your phone, he had to invent his own. Plato's alarm clock was a water-based system consisting of 2 ceramic jars. Water would drip slowly from the upper jar into the lower one through a narrow opening, acting like a water clock. However, the lower jar was sealed and had a lead pipe with a whistle at the top. When the water reached a certain level, the air inside the jar was forced out through the pipe at high pressure, creating a piercing, screeching sound that could be heard across the academy. It was probably the most annoying sound in Athens, but it ensured that his students were out of bed and ready to debate the nature of the soul before the sun was even up. It just goes to show that no matter how many thousands of years pass, the human struggle of wanting 5 more minutes of sleep and the genius required to ruin that sleep remains exactly the same. If you think the most terrifying thing on an ancient battlefield was a 300-pound Spartan with a spear, you have clearly never faced a battalion of 300 men who were all deeply, passionately in love with each other. History books often focus on the rigid discipline of Sparta, But for a brief, glorious moment, the most feared military unit in the world was the Sacred Band of Thebes. This was an elite force made up of 150 pairs of male lovers. The logic behind this was as brilliant as it was brutal. A soldier might be tempted to flee to save his own skin, but he would never, under any circumstances, show cowardice or abandon the field while his lover was watching. They fought with a ferocity that defied belief, because for them, every battle was a personal defense of their partner's life and honor. They were the ones who finally broke the myth of Spartan invincibility at the Battle of Leuctra. When the Sacred Band finally met their end at the hands of Philip II of Macedon, they died exactly as they lived, standing in a line, shoulder to shoulder, refusing to retreat until the last pair had fallen together. King Philip himself supposedly wept when he saw their bodies, remarking that anyone who thought there was anything shameful about these men was a fool. It is a stark reminder that in the ancient world, the boundaries of love and war were blurred in ways that would make a modern drill sergeant's head spin. But while the Greeks were progressive in their views on brotherhood, they were absolutely terrified of anyone who looked a little too different, especially if you happened to have red hair. In ancient Greece, if you were born with a ginger mane, people didn't just think you were unique, they thought you were a ticking time bomb for the supernatural. There was a widespread and genuine belief that people with red hair were destined to turn into vrikolakas, the Greek version of a vampire, after they died. The reasoning was as shaky as ancient medicine. Red hair was seen as a sign of an unbalanced soul, or a connection to the fiery underworld. To prevent these red-headed vampires from rising from their graves to terrorize the living, the Greeks sometimes performed gruesome post-mortem rituals, such as pinning the bodies down with heavy stones, or even burying them face down, so that if they tried to dig their way out, they would only go deeper into the earth. It sounds like a plot from a low-budget horror movie, but for a red-headed Greek, the fear of what would happen to your corpse was a very real social stigma that followed you to the grave and beyond. Speaking of graves and endurance, we need to talk about the biggest lie ever told about the Olympic Games, the story of the marathon. We've all heard the legend of Phidippides, the messenger who ran 26 miles from the battlefield of Marathon to Athens, shouted Nike, meaning victory, and then promptly dropped dead from exhaustion. It's a poetic, heroic story that inspired the modern race, but the reality was much, much worse. According to the actual historical accounts by Herodotus, Phidippides didn't just run 26 miles. Before the battle even started, he was sent from Athens to Sparta to beg for military help. That is a distance of about 150 miles across rugged mountainous terrain, which he covered in just 2 days. Then he ran all the way back. By the time the actual Battle of Marathon happened, he had already run the equivalent of 6 modern marathons back to back. The death run to Athens was likely a later romantic invention by poets. In reality, the entire Athenian army, burdened with heavy bronze armor, had to sprint back to the city after the battle to prevent a Persian naval attack. The true marathon wasn't one guy running for glory, it was thousands of exhausted, bleeding soldiers doing a forced march at high speed to save their families. Phidippides might have died, but it wasn't the 26 miles that killed him, it was the 300 miles of desperate sprinting that came before it. While the men were out running themselves to death or falling in love on the battlefield, the women of Sparta were becoming the most powerful females in the Mediterranean. If you were a woman in Athens, your life was basically a gilded cage. You stayed indoors, managed the weaving, and rarely spoke to men who weren't relatives.
But Sparta was a completely different planet. Because Spartan men were professional soldiers who lived in barracks until age 30, the women were left in charge of everything. Spartan women could own property, they could inherit land, and by the 4th century BC, they reportedly owned nearly 40% of all the land in Sparta. They were famous for their bossy attitudes and sharp tongues. When an Athenian woman once asked Gorgo, the queen of Sparta, why Spartan women were the only ones who could rule men, she coolly replied, "Because we are the only ones who give birth to real men." They were also encouraged to exercise in public, often competing in races and wrestling matches while wearing short tunics or even nothing at all, a practice that scandalized the rest of the Greek world, but ensured they were physically fit enough to manage the state and survive childbirth. In a world of patriarchy, the Spartan woman was the ultimate anomaly, a female power player who didn't take nonsense from anyone. However, no one in Greece was better at not taking nonsense than Diogenes the Cynic. If there was ever a grand master of zero given, it was this guy. Diogenes was a philosopher who decided that civilization was a scam and that the only way to be truly free was to live like a dog, hence the name cynic, which comes from the Greek word for canine. He didn't live in a house, he lived in a large ceramic storage jar in the middle of the Athenian marketplace. He walked around in broad daylight with a lit lantern, claiming he was looking for an honest man, but finding only fools. He would eat, sleep, and even perform his most private bodily functions right there in public to prove that social taboos were meaningless. The most famous story involves Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the world, who traveled to meet the famous philosopher. Alexander found Diogenes lounging in the sun and asked if there was any favor he could do for him. Any other man would have asked for gold or a kingdom. Diogenes just looked up at the conqueror of nations and said, "Yeah, move a little to the side, you're blocking my sunlight." Alexander was so impressed by this level of audacity that he famously said, "If I were not Alexander, I would want to be Diogenes." It is the ultimate historical mic drop, proving that you don't need a palace or an army to be the most influential person in the room. Sometimes you just need a barrel and a complete lack of shame. While we are on the subject of eccentric geniuses who lived by their own bizarre sets of rules, we have to talk about Pythagoras. Most of us remember him as the guy who made our middle school geometry classes a living nightmare with his theorem about triangles. But in his own time, Pythagoras was less of a mathematician and more of a mysterious cult leader. He founded a school in Italy that was part religious sect and part math camp, where his followers had to follow incredibly strict rules, like never eating white roosters or never poking a fire with a sword. But his most famous and baffling rule was a total, absolute ban on beans. Pythagoras had a pathological hatred for fava beans. He believed that beans were spiritually connected to the souls of the dead, or that they looked far too much like human fetuses. He even went as far as to suggest that eating a bean was equivalent to eating the head of your own parent. This obsession supposedly led to his tragic and slightly hilarious downfall. According to legend, Pythagoras was being chased by a group of angry political enemies who wanted to kill him. He was sprinting for his life and had a clear path to safety, but then he reached the edge of a fava bean field. Rather than trample the sacred beans or touch them, he stopped dead in his tracks and declared he would rather die than cross the field. The mob caught up with him and slit his throat right then and there. It is the ultimate irony. The man who unlocked the secrets of the universe was taken out by a vegetable. If the philosophers were weird, the doctors were downright stomach-churning. Hippocrates is widely celebrated as the father of modern medicine, and every doctor today still takes the Hippocratic Oath. But if you actually saw his diagnostic methods in person, you would probably choose to just stay sick and take your chances with the gods.
Before the invention of blood tests, X-rays, or stethoscopes, Hippocrates believed that the secret to understanding a patient's health lay in the flavor profile of their bodily fluids. Yes, to be a top-tier physician in ancient Greece, you had to be a professional taster of things that should never be tasted. If a patient was feeling unwell, the doctor might take a sample of their earwax and give it a good lick. If it tasted bitter, the patient was healthy. If it was sweet, something was wrong. They would taste sweat to check for salt imbalances, and most famously, they would taste urine. They could actually diagnose certain conditions by the sweetness or acidity of a person's pee. Imagine the dedication required to spend 8 years studying the humors of the body, only to realize your primary job description is basically being a human dipstick for a stranger's bladder. It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase, the bitter taste of medicine.
When the Greeks weren't busy tasting urine for science, they were busy drinking wine, but they did it with a level of snobbery that would make a French sommelier blush. To a Greek, wine was the drink of civilization, but drinking it neat or undiluted was considered the ultimate sign of a barbarian. If you walked into a party and drank straight wine, the Greeks would look at you with the same horror we might feel watching someone eat a bowl of raw flour. They always mixed their wine with water, usually in a ratio of 1 part wine to 3 parts water. The goal of a Greek drinking party or symposium wasn't to get blackout drunk, it was to reach a state of philosophical tipsiness where the conversation could flow without everyone falling over. In fact, they believed that drinking undiluted wine would cause permanent brain damage, insanity, or even death. This is why they looked down so harshly on the Scythians and other northern tribes who drank their wine straight. To the Greeks, being able to control your intake and dilute your alcohol was what separated a man of reason from a wild animal. Of course, they still drank enough to stay buzzed for hours, but they did it with the dignified pretense that they were just hydrating with flavor. Control and discipline were the hallmarks of Greek life, but nowhere was this more extreme than in Sparta, where even music was treated like a weapon of war. We usually think of music as a form of artistic expression, but for the Spartans, it was a tool for psychological conditioning. They used heavy, rhythmic flute music to keep their phalanx formations moving in perfect, terrifying unison on the battlefield. Because they took music so seriously as a source of moral character, the Spartan government, the ephors, acted as the world's first and most aggressive music censors. There's a famous story about a musician named Timotheus who came to Sparta to perform. He had added extra strings to his lyre to allow for a wider range of notes and more complex emotional melodies. The Spartans were so offended by this soft and decadent innovation that an official walked onto the stage with a knife and literally hacked the extra strings off his instrument. They believed that complex music would make their soldiers' hearts soft and their minds weak. In Sparta, you played the traditional tunes, you played them on the traditional instruments, and you didn't dare try to be creative, or the state would literally cut your vibes down to size. But if you really wanted to know the future of a war or the fate of a kingdom, you didn't go to a soldier or a musician. You went to a tiny, dark basement in Delphi to talk to a woman who was essentially huffing volcanic gas. The Oracle of Delphi was the most powerful person in the Greek world. From kings like Croesus to generals like Themistocles, everyone consulted the Pythia before making a big move. The Pythia was an older woman who would sit on a tripod over a literal crack in the earth, breathing in divine vapors and babbling incoherently. A priestess would then translate these screams into cryptic verses. For centuries, people thought this was just a myth, but modern geological surveys have discovered that the temple at Delphi sits directly on top of 2 intersecting fault lines. These faults leaked ethylene gas, a hydrocarbon that in low doses induces a state of euphoria and hallucinogenic trance. The divine inspiration was actually just high-grade geological anesthesia.
It's wild to think that the entire course of Western history, from the Persian Wars to the rise of empires, was dictated by the drug-induced ramblings of a woman sitting in a hole in the ground, high on prehistoric swamp gas. If you walk into any major museum today, you are greeted by a sea of pristine, ghostly white marble statues that radiate a sense of calm, intellectual purity. We have spent centuries convincing ourselves that the Greeks were the masters of minimalist chic, preferring the raw elegance of white stone. But if you were to actually step into an ancient Greek city, you would probably need a pair of sunglasses just to cope with the visual assault. Those statues weren't white. They were painted in colors so bright and garish they would make a modern circus look understated. The Greeks loved color. They painted their gods with bright blue hair, neon red robes, and tan skin, often decorating them with gold and jewels. The Parthenon itself was once a riot of blues, reds, and yellows. The reason we see them as white today is simply because the paint wore off over 2,000 years of wind and rain, and early Renaissance scholars, who thought the white look was classier, literally scrubbed away the remaining traces of pigment to fit their own aesthetic fantasies.
we have been looking at a bleached, skeletonized version of Greece for 500 years, missing out on the fact that the cradle of democracy was actually as colorful as a comic book convention. This obsession with appearances and the divine even followed their greatest leaders to the grave, or, in the case of Alexander the Great, perhaps a bit too early. When Alexander died in Babylon at the age of 32, his body reportedly didn't show any signs of decay for 6 days. To the ancient Greeks and Macedonians, this was the ultimate proof that Alexander was not a mere mortal, but a god whose flesh was incorruptible. However, modern science has a much more terrifying explanation. Many medical historians now believe that Alexander suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological disorder that causes total paralysis while the mind remains perfectly conscious. Because ancient doctors checked for breath rather than a pulse, and because Alexander's breathing would have been so shallow it was almost invisible, he was likely declared dead while he was still very much alive. Imagine the horror of being the most powerful man on earth, unable to move a finger or blink an eye, as you watch your generals begin to fight over your empire and the embalmers start preparing your body for a funeral you aren't ready for. The miracle of his non-decaying body wasn't divine intervention. It was just a man slowly suffocating in his own skin while his doctors celebrated his godhood. While Alexander was accidentally being buried alive, the everyday streets of Greek cities were home to a much more practical form of marketing. Ancient Greek sex workers were some of the most tech-savvy entrepreneurs of their time, and they used the very ground people walked on as their billboard. They wore specially designed sandals with soles that had messages carved into them in reverse. The most common message was the word akoushuthe, which literally means "follow me." As they walked through the dusty streets or sandy paths of the city, they left a trail of footprints that acted like a primitive GPS for potential clients. A man looking for company didn't need to ask around or look for a sign. He just had to look down at the dirt and follow the literal breadcrumbs of desire until he reached the doorstep of the woman he was looking for. It was a brilliant, silent, and highly effective way to navigate the strict social taboos of the time, proving that even thousands of years ago, people knew exactly how to use foot traffic to their advantage. But the real heart of Greek social life wasn't on the streets, it was at the symposium. Now, when we hear the word symposium today, we think of a boring academic conference with bad coffee and PowerPoint slides. In ancient Greece, a symposium was a high-stakes drinking party where the smartest men in the city gathered to get drunk and talk about the meaning of life. But it wasn't just philosophy, it was also home to the world's weirdest drinking game, kottabos. The goal of kottabos was simple but messy. After you finished your wine, you would leave a little bit of dregs at the bottom of your shallow cup. You would then hook your finger through the handle, swing the cup around, and flick the wine dregs at a target across the room, usually a bronze disc balanced on a stand. If you hit the disc and knocked it down with a satisfying clang, you were the winner. People would bet money, slaves, or even favors on these tosses. It was essentially the ancient version of beer pong, except instead of a plastic cup in a frat house, you were playing it with Socrates while debating whether the soul is immortal. It's a perfect snapshot of the Greek mind, one half reaching for the stars and the other half trying to hit a plate with a splash of fermented grape juice. Finally, we have to address the darkest myth of the Greek world, the one that makes every modern parent shiver, the Spartan baby pit. For centuries, we have been told that the Spartans were so obsessed with physical perfection that they would take any newborn baby who looked weak or unfit and toss them into a jagged chasm at the foot of Mount Taygetos. This story has been used for ages to paint the Spartans as a society of heartless monsters. However, recent archaeological excavations of the actual chasm, known as the Kaiadas, have revealed something surprising. While there are plenty of human remains at the bottom of the pit, they almost all belong to adult men, likely criminals, prisoners of war, or traitors. There is a conspicuous lack of infant bones. It turns out that while the Spartans were definitely tough and probably did practice some form of infant exposure, the idea of a systematic baby-tossing conveyor belt was likely a bit of Athenian propaganda or an exaggeration by later historians like Plutarch. The Spartans were brutal, yes, but they weren't wasteful. A weak baby might not become a frontline soldier, but they could still be useful to the state in other ways. So, as we close the book on these ancient legends, we are left with a picture of Greece that is far more human than the statues suggest. They were a people who invented the future, but were held back by the past. They were brilliant engineers who built computers, and yet they were superstitious enough to kill a man over a field of beans. They were poets and philosophers who drank diluted wine and wiped themselves with stones. They were just like us, brilliant, disgusting, ambitious, and deeply, deeply weird. And perhaps that is the most shocking fact of all, that beneath the marble and the myths, the Greeks were just people trying to figure out the world, one wine flick and one follow-me sandal print at a time.